This is Emerging Sustainably, a podcast series exploring the broadening focus on sustainability and its impact on local governments in Victoria. Welcome to episode 1 of our 3-part series, Emerging Sustainably. Each year, LG Pro supports a group of up to 24 Victorian local government officers, providing them with the opportunity to develop their leadership skills by participating in the Emerging Leaders Program, or ELP. The ELP provides a unique year of leadership-focused experiences and activities designed to develop and inspire emerging leaders in local government in Victoria. Within the program, ELP participants were tasked to deliver a project on the role of local government in environmental and climate sustainability in the workplace. The outcome of the project was the Emerging Sustainably podcast series, along with the written report available on the LG Pro website. The report offers an insight into the group's learnings throughout the year. Recorded on location at the LG Pro offices in Melbourne, each episode is a panel discussion hosted by 2019 ELP participants and young people from the Victorian Student Representative Council, or SRC. To explore a variety of perspectives, the episodes feature guests including a former council CEO, current councillors, and sustainability experts. In this first episode, 2019 ELP participants talk with Zaytuna and Kalina from the Victorian SRC, alongside Darebin City Council Mayor Susan Rennie and former Mayor and current councillor Tony Stevenson of Yarra Ranges Council. The session is moderated by Christian Thomas.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We're here to talk today at LG Pro offices about what is local government's role in sustainability. We want to explore what sustainability means in the local government context. We want to understand what our communities expect. We want to understand what our community leaders expect to happen from our organisations. So I thought a really good place to start the conversation would probably just be to do a bit of a whip around the room and introduce ourselves. My name is Christian Thomas. I work for Baw Baw Shire Council. I believe that sustainability is going to affect us no matter what people happen to believe is the reality around climate change. And I think it's highly important that we discuss this topic and come to some kind of consensus as a community.
I'm Susan Rennie. I'm the Mayor of the City of Darebin. And at Darebin, we are a council that cares really deeply about this stuff, and we're the first council in the world to declare a climate emergency. So a whole lot of work has taken place since that time. That was in December 2016.
So I'm Councillor Tony Stevenson, Yarra Ranges Council. I've just stepped down as Mayor, so a little bit more time to share the work around with everyone else. Yarra Ranges Council nestled in the hills, Dandenong Ranges and the valley. I think Yarra Valley, beautiful, pristine country in many cases, which we absolutely value, we need to keep and look after. And we've had long-standing policies that preserve that. Obviously, the environment is key, and what we're seeing happen globally and what we're seeing locally is important. So, as far back as 2008, Yarra Ranges Council has been working in collaboration with other councils, and including Darebin, in many ways to identify ways in which we can be more environmentally friendly in the way we go about things. And I think we're starting to see the fruits of that come to bear.
I'm Kalina Page. I'm a Year 11 student from Upwey in the Yarra Ranges. I'm really interested in global warming and the environment and so on because I think that it's something that will greatly affect the future of every young person. So it's something that I'd like to become more involved in and hopefully do something to help out.
Likewise, my name is Zaytuna. I'm a recent Year 12 graduate. I also am very interested in sustainability and in terms of climate change because it's an urgent issue. I believe that it should be like a talking point.
I'm Jess Bailey, also Yarra Ranges Council, so there's a few of us, which is going to be an interesting conversation. My background is certainly working with young people in sustainability, but my role at Yarra Ranges Council is facilities management, so all of the building infrastructure, including potentially maintaining solar panels and water tanks and more importantly, what goes on inside those buildings is something that I'm interested to see if there's a role of local government in supporting sustainability initiatives in our built infrastructure that we haven't yet realised that we might have some insights in today.
Can I maybe ask Kalina and Zaytuna, as the young representatives on the panel, can you maybe have a chat to us about what you think your local councils are doing in relation to sustainability, or if you can't think of anything they're doing, what do you think they should be doing?
I'm honestly not too sure about what the Yarra Ranges Council is doing. I haven't really looked into it. I've been more focusing on what sort of things I'm doing at home. But I'd like to see maybe posters or other things up promoting living sustainably in the towns and in the communities to help make other people aware of what they could be doing to live sustainably.
I think this is really interesting because I recently finished year 12. So I have a lot of my textbooks and a lot of my notes and study notes and all these paper that I wanted to recycle. I called up my council, which is Stonington, and I was like, hello, is there any way that I can recycle this paper? Because I didn't want to just put it in the yellow bin because it often just goes to the landfill. So I was like, oh, maybe I can see what they can do. Yeah, I spoke to a lovely lady and she was like, sorry, I can only recommend that you put it in the yellow bin. She said that at council, it doesn't have anything to do with that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I just thought that was really interesting. Thinking about it now, there's thousands and thousands of year 12s or even other students that have all this paper going to waste, and that's adding on the landfill, and that often trickles down into other effects. Yeah, and contributes to climate change also. There's a gap between the community and the council members, I feel like, especially between the youth. Just because there's a disconnect. We don't feel comfortable enough to go and ask, or it's kind of awkward. So I hope that this can kind of break the barrier and people become more comfortable to have a conversation, because I think it's vital at the moment.
Yeah, conversations are an incredibly powerful thing, and I think this sort of forum is a great opportunity for us to start having some of those discussions. But the takeaway from you, Kalina, is that there's potentially a role there around education and awareness and promotion of what can be done. And as I tune her, it sounds like your specific point there was really around waste, and obviously local government are responsible for providing waste services, so it's delivery of waste services, so that's something that we can certainly talk about. For the councillors on the panel, has your council made any public statements about the state of the climate?
Absolutely. Darebin Council, as I said, was the first council in the world to declare a climate emergency, and that was in December 2016. It was at our very first council meeting of this term, and it was our number one priority to put that on the agenda and make sure that everyone understood at all levels of council that that was something we expected to be prioritised very highly. I'd really like to pick up on what Zaytuna said, because I think that it reflects the difficulty of thinking of this issue just as one that can be solved through trying to get individuals to do the right thing, and that we have to move beyond that kind of paradigm of individual responsibility and start thinking about, are the settings and the environment and the regulation there to support individuals in making good choices? And at the moment they're not sufficiently, because some people are still living in council areas where the recycling is going to landfill because they haven't managed to re-establish a recycling service after the collapse of SKM. I'm not sure what the situation in Yarra Ranges is. We're really pleased in Darebin that we were able to get another recycling provider, so we're now confident that our recycling is being recycled. But if you live in an area where there is no recycling service, it's not just about the good choices you make, it's about the fact that there isn't an environment of controls that actually support those choices. And increasingly, I think we can do everything we can as individuals, but we actually have to look at the extent to which the laws and regulations are in place to actually respond to the climate emergency, and they're clearly not at a state or a federal level. And that's one of the reasons Darebin Council has stepped up and declared a climate emergency, because we see other levels of government failing us so dismally.
It's interesting, we're very conscious, we see in the media a lot about, due to the inaction from state and federal governments, local governments, not just here but also internationally. I'm thinking specifically of the ones over in the United States who, even though the US is talking about pulling out of international agreements, they might be very large cities, but the mayors of some fairly large American cities are talking about, we'll pick that up and we'll carry that on ourselves, even without that leadership. Do you see a similar role for local government in the Australian context?
Absolutely, and I think that's why councils are stepping into this space, because we have this failure of state and federal governments, and we've demonstrated that we can actually do stuff that's really meaningful. So at Darebin Council, we're looking, of course we have that education piece for members of the community, but more importantly, council's looking at all of its operations and how we move towards zero emissions in our operations, and we're looking at doing that across every part of council business. So it's not just about where we get our electricity, it's also about looking at emissions that come from landfill, and that's why we've just moved to a green waste, food waste collection, because when food waste goes to landfill it creates quite significant emissions. We've looked at our road resurfacing program to actually rethink the materials we're using, and they're now more than 95% recycled. But then beyond that, we're actually looking at how we can influence other local governments. And I think our power purchase agreement that we're working on at the moment is a really good example of that. So Darebin Council has collectively got on board 48 councils around Victoria to pool our power purchasing requirements to establish a market for new renewable energy. Because it's a difficult space to get into, particularly with state and federal governments failing to promote investment in green energy. In order for new renewable energy generation to be created, there needs to be market certainty. So the people who might invest in creating a new wind farm, for example, need to know that there's going to be someone who will buy that power. By 48 councils getting together and saying, we will buy that power together, it enables someone to actually start up new green energy. Now that's kind of half of Victoria local government's energy needs. Not only can we do that, but then we can actually share that model with other sectors. We might be able to go out to universities, for example, and say, look what we did. If you all get together, you could do the same type of thing. And developing new models means that we can move on even when the state and the federal governments are not doing enough. In the case of the federal government, really not doing anything.
So has the Yarra Ranges Council made any public statements regarding the state of the environment?
Absolutely. I think to put it in context, since at least 2008, Yarra Ranges Council's on record as saying that climate change is real, the science is in, and we need to do something about it. That's been reasserted most recently in September 2019 with acknowledgement we do exist in a state of climate emergency, and it's really important we accelerate our efforts to address that. So that's taking on a role not only looking at the things that we can control in terms of local government, but also the things we influence, because it's both of those things that are really important. So I think, as Susan said, it's important to demonstrate leadership to the community and broadly across the sector. We've joined with Darebin and those near 40 other councils in power purchase agreement, and there is absolutely strength in numbers that we achieve more if we work together. And it's really important because the community themselves have these concerns. Any sort of research you can do, and we don't need to go and spend a lot of money as councillors to establish these things, because there is plenty of information out there that just says how many people are concerned about it. And probably the reverse of that is that there are very few people numerically who actually are seriously contending the science and opposing the commonly held view. So I think some figures are between 5 to 7% of people are sceptical. Unfortunately, they're very dominant in the media, and they're quite loud in the community. So it's important that we bring out the facts that most people are quite concerned, that Yarra Ranges Council, along with many other councils, are doing really important things in terms of how we're reducing our own environmental footprint, in terms of our own operations and the activities we're doing to support and educate and influence the community and other layers of government to change their ways as well.
I'm interested to know if any of you have undertaken consultation with the public in regards to environmental sustainability and or climate change.
That's a great question. Darebin Council, we're constantly consulting with community on different issues, kind of big and small, related to this issue. So one of the reasons that we declared a climate emergency back in 2016 was because the community were telling us really clearly that that was important to them, and they were speaking to candidates before the council elections to say this really mattered. When it comes to different council programs, we undertake consultation. So we reach out to find out from people what kind of information they need, what kind of policies we should put in place. So with most council policies, before they're adopted by council, they go on exhibition and community members can have a look and respond to them. And also, when we're thinking of undertaking a new program, we actually reach out to community in different ways, and that can be through face-to-face sessions with people in the community, can be online. We have a Darebin Your Say page online where community can give us feedback on different things that council is doing. And we know from listening to our community that this issue matters a great deal. We also did quite a big kind of research project around how we talk to our community about the climate emergency. So that was about messaging, and it was about what kind of language is going to be most effective at getting the community on board. And when we did that, we actually engaged a consulting group who had a lot of experience thinking about how do you talk to people about social issues, what's the language that you used, and that research then informs the sort of language we use and the messaging, because we need to make sure that we get that right, that we are getting people on board, that they're keen to see action, they understand the gravity of the situation that we're facing, and they understand why council is investing. And I think that's really important, because if we go off and do things without the community understand why we're investing their rates in that area, then we can lose community support.
And you, Tony?
Oh, absolutely. It's critically important that anything that council does that involves policy development is done through community engagement. There is consultation. We are ultimately representative democracy, and if we're out of step with the community, then we have a problem. I mean, conversely, there's a leadership role as well. Sometimes we need to be a step ahead of the community and bring them forward, and I think what Darebin has done is a very good example of that. In the case of Yarra Ranges, we've had a policy since 2012 that relates to reducing our own energy consumption and our greenhouse gas production. Our aim was to reduce them by 30% from 2000 levels, and we're going to achieve that by 2020, so that's on target. In collaboration with other councils, that power purchase agreement will drive that down to 50%, which is fantastic. And because that policy has now reached its end and we've hit those goals, we're currently preparing new policies, and early in the new year we'll go out to the community and we'll undertake that engagement. Absolutely, we'll need to convince people why this is an important investment. And there's a whole spectrum of views out there. Some who think we could do so much more, and probably they might think we could never do enough in the absence of others doing enough. Others question why we're doing it at all. So for the people who might be saying, well, why have you put 3,000 solar panels on 39 new buildings? We don't necessarily believe that's a good use of money, or we don't think that that's necessary given what's happening in the world at large. We may not have an argument with them about their views on climate change. What we can say is that saved $1 million a year in perpetuity for people in Yarra Ranges. So they might say things like, well, we'd rather you fix that pothole. Well, instead of spending $1 million really wasting it on electricity that's going to some electricity generator, it's definitely not in Yarra Ranges, and could even be owned by a foreign company, much rather free that money up so we can invest it locally on other programs, so we can do more sustainability initiatives or do things that are really important locally. I think it's important, we touched on this a little bit earlier, the role of local government. Why should local government be involved in this? If you go to the Local Government Act, and I'm sorry I haven't memorised it exactly, but there's something in there that speaks of the role of local government. It's actually very specifically prescribed, unlike even the role of, say, the state government or federal government. There's a very specific aims and objectives of local government, and one of the clauses in there speaks specifically of being focused on quality of life. And this issue is probably nothing more pertinent to the quality of life than ensuring that people can continue to live the lives they wish to live in a changing climate. Fundamentally, the way we go about many things in our society will change if nothing changes in terms of the way we go about continuing to burn fossil fuels, for example. So it's absolutely critical that we do all we can in local government to ensure that we can sustain people's current quality of life and ideally improve it.
Susan, do you agree with that sentiment?
Absolutely. I think that when people say, local governments should stick to roads, rates and rubbish, they really don't know what they're talking about. And I wonder how connected they are to their local communities. Have they never been to the local pool? Have they never been to the local library? Did they not use council's maternal and child health services? And similarly, council having a role in how we make sure that our local environment is pleasant in terms of the natural environment is really important. That every council has to take responsibility for ensuring that the world is a livable place. And some of that starts locally with looking after your own natural environment and your parks and your creeks and your waterways and your sports fields and all of those green open spaces. But some of it has to involve showing the leadership required to make sure that the whole world is like that, because we can't just think, well, our boundaries are contained here and what happens outside of our municipal boundaries has no bearing. At a very local level, we've got 2 creeks in Darebin that run either side of the municipality. If we were to say, well, we're just going to look after our bit, it's not our concern what happens elsewhere, we know that doesn't work, because the rubbish and the pollution that goes in upstream in Hume or Mitchell or other municipalities, that comes down to our community. And it's the same kind of principle that the rubbish and the pollution that happens in other parts parts of the world ultimately impacts on what we do in Darebin, and therefore it is our responsibility to think about it. And particularly when I hear federal politicians saying that nonsense about roads, rates and rubbish, it just tells me how very, very disconnected they are from their local communities.
So how important to your community is it that the council adopts sustainable practices? So would they be happy to have higher rates in exchange for more sustainable services?
Look, there are some members of our community who have clearly said they're willing to pay to see more progress. One of the things we have in Victoria is actually rate capping. So we're constrained in the rates we can charge anyway. We can't increase our rates by more than the annual rate cap, which is about 2% a year. So it's a bit of a moot point, but I'm actually confident that if we went out to some parts of our community, they would say, yeah, we're willing to pay more to see progress here, because they understand that actually unless we fix the climate crisis, we're not really going to have a pleasant community to live in, and it's all going to be completely irrelevant. At the same time, I recognise there are parts of our community where they simply can't afford higher rates, and where paying the current rate bill is a problem. So I don't think it's just about cost. I think it's also about doing things more wisely and recognising that shifting your business practices can make a huge impact but doesn't actually have to cost a whole lot more. So we've shifted our road resurfacing contracts to include recycled material. That's not costing us a whole lot more. It's just doing business differently. Tony mentioned shifting your electricity purchasing or putting solar panels on roofs. You know, there's an outlay in the first instance, but ultimately it saves you money. And so this shouldn't be thought of as just a cost thing. But the other thing I would say is that the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the cost of acting. So when people say, but what does that cost? It's kind of like, well, what will it cost if we don't get this right? We will not have a livable planet. We will not have livable communities. We will see more older people dying in heat waves from heat stress because they're not able to stay cool. And I think we need to start talking about those costs. And we're already seeing those costs in more extreme weather events. And if those extreme weather events continue, we're facing a future where we won't be able to get insurance for certain events because they will become too frequent, and the cost of insurance will outstrip our capacity to pay. And so that's the cost of not acting, and the cost of doing something actually pales into insignificance relative to the costs that we might incur in our solar programs, in our power purchasing programs, in fixing up our business so that we're showing leadership.
And you, Tony?
Absolutely. I think more and more people value sustainable practices and would certainly encourage them, as does council. When it comes to rates, though, this is the challenge we face, because Yarra Ranges is the largest metropolitan council. It's an area that's 3 times the size of Singapore, to put it in proportion. So we already are incredibly stretched in servicing that area. So you've got 158,000 people over 2,500 square kilometres, over 2,000 kilometres of roads, 732 kilometres of those are unsealed. So just the rate base we have now is largely consumed with keeping things running. So it's difficult to say, let's just stop doing some things to free up cash. But Susan's absolutely right. There is huge opportunities for innovation and thinking about things differently. And if we can do it collaboratively with other councils or working cooperatively with other layers of government, we can achieve a lot more, and we can really stretch those dollars further. So I think the first instinct has to be, what can we do within our current means? Really, everything we're talking about climate change is about us living as a human race within our resources. It's living sustainability. So I think that does start with local governments thinking about, well, what can we do within the resources we have? Let's not try and have more resources. Let's find ways of doing that, and working cooperatively with our community as well to encourage them to do things in a similar way. There are many things. We've identified probably the what would be referred to as the lowest hanging fruit in terms of solar panels. They're absolutely brilliant. The way they're priced these days, they'll pay for themselves in 5 to 7 years, and they'll last at least 25, 30 years. So they'll pay for themselves 4 or 5 times over. So it's the economics of it, it's really a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you do it? If you've got the roof space, you'd absolutely do it. We've reached the point in Yarra Ranges, we've actually run out of roof space. We've got no more council buildings to put panels on, and we're now building things like shade structures at water play areas to put on more solar panels, because we think that's going to be good for that local community, giving them shade in a changing climate, and also renewable energy. But there's other things we can explore, and we are exploring. But perhaps some of the early wins and the easiest ones have been done. We now approach that point to say we will have to start spending more money to achieve the rest of the gains. So we're looking closely at having slashed our greenhouse gases by 50%. And that's taken a lot of time to achieve that since 2012 to now. In the next couple of years, when we get the power purchase agreement, getting the next 50% is probably harder. But things have moved on as well. So when we first looked at this, say in 2012, there was no such thing really as a practical electric car, but now there is. So we can forecast over the coming years to say, well, what happens if we switch our fleet over to ideally 100%, but even if we said 80% of all our vehicles that we use for council are electric, what does that do for our footprint? So with changes in technology, there's more that we can do, but it's important to say procrastination really is an option, and I really am concerned, as Susan's said as well, that seems to be the federal policy, is procrastination. Let's defer this. Let's hope technology is going to come along and save us. Don't worry about it, it'll all get sorted. That's really not an answer. I think
thoughts and prayers are...
Yeah, it's really, as people, you need to act or be acted on. If we don't take action, action will be taken on us, and we'll feel that, and we'll feel it for generations. So absolutely critical that we take the necessary steps now, and the earlier we act and the earlier we drive change, the better. The longer we leave it, the harder adaptation will be, the more we will struggle with inevitably a much harder job.
When we talk about community, we have to recognise also that community is diverse and people have a range of views. So there are some people who think we pay too many rates and we should pay less and council should deliver less. But equally, we have community members who have said to us, you should stop doing absolutely everything and spend every spare cent on responding to the climate emergency. There's nothing more urgent. If it's not urgent business, you should stop doing it. You should stop fixing other things and you should just invest. And so we have that spectrum of views in community, which, you know, it's kind of great because it creates a community debate. But I think it's just worth remembering that, you know, community is diverse, and we use this word as though it's one thing, but it's so many things with so many opinions and perspectives.
And that's a really interesting perspective too, thinking about the broadness of community. And the first part of the question we talked about was how important is it to the community. So I think what we're saying is there's some part of the community who 100% believes that sustainability is a critical issue, but it sounds like there's also parts of the community that feel differently.
I think on climate, this is a tricky one because it is actually so terrifying when we think about the magnitude of the problem and how serious it is. And so we have people who say, we get how serious this is and there is nothing more important that anyone can do than address this issue. And then there's other people who, you know, have heard of climate change and accept that it's real, but maybe don't understand the severity of where we find ourselves and the actual extent to which this is an emergency. And then probably I think there's a group who kind of hear that science and find it so alarming that they don't want to think too much about it because it seems so huge and so overwhelming that if you don't know where to start, it's easy to kind of compartmentalise and not think about it, and a whole range of other perspectives. You know, for decades I've worked in public health, and public health's a really great field to work in. It's about actually improving the environments in which we live so that people can live healthier lives. And even as someone who's campaigned on public health for many years, to my way of thinking, there is no more significant or important issue than responding to the climate emergency, because no one is healthy on a dead or a dying planet. And so we cannot be a healthy community, we cannot have public health if we don't get our response to the climate emergency right.
Tony, in terms of your community, do you find there's a mix of people? Some people are very engaged and want council to adopt sustainable practices. Do you find there's other members of the community who feel differently, or maybe have that traditional council should, you know, stick to roads, rates, rubbish, that sort of view?
Yeah, I think every community is diverse. We as a nation are diverse. But I think it's important that you need to be able to take a leadership position. You can't leap out well ahead of the crowd and say, we need to be here, because you won't be able to bring people with you. But you need to be able to marshal enough people who are concerned and are willing to adopt change and drive change, and support and encourage them, and hope that you can bring others with you. It is a huge dilemma we're facing, because we've seen change in the past as a society and around the world. If you think about middle of the 19th century, the emancipation of slaves was something of a similar level that affected many people, but particularly those that are in chains. And it took a concerted effort across multiple continents to have that change. But there were people even then arguing it's bad for business. Giving up slavery, that's going to put up our business costs. We can't have that. There was wars fought over it and a whole lot of resistance. But enough good-hearted people, enough willing people pushed really hard and change was delivered. So change isn't easy. Change is quite difficult. We've seen similar things on a health point of view. The first public pronouncements about the effects of cigarette on people's lives were the US Surgeon General 1962, and Australia progressively got on board, and I think from about the mid-70s banned TV advertising, radio advertising, and so we've seen a change in our society, and I probably more recollect the figures for men because they're some of the worst offenders. At the end of World War II, 72% of Australian males smoked. Now today that's 17%. So it's a huge change. It's gone about because there's been a concerted effort in the community, at all levels of government. There's been both carrots and sticks applied in terms of driving that change. There's been public education, there's been, penalties in terms of increased cost of cigarettes. But today we still have 17% of men smoking and close to that number of women, and it's often some younger people still doing it. So I suppose that's a bit reflective of the challenge we face, that we're not a dictatorship here. We can't tell people what to do. We can't demand that they take action. Particularly in local government, we can encourage it and we can support it and we can persuade people as best we can, and we can work with other community groups to help foster that change. But the last thing we should be doing is getting in a position of telling people what to do, because that doesn't work and people do resist, and we're not going to achieve what we all need to achieve if we start getting too belligerent about it.
And it's fascinating, speaking of people being told what to do, our young people, as you're nearing the end of your high school time or might have just finished year 12, which is a very exciting time for you all, I'm interested to know what your perspectives from your community, like you guys as the next generation coming through, how important is your local government adopting sustainability practices to you? And keeping in mind that it's still early days for you, do you think that your generation is going to be willing to pay higher costs for sustainable practice if that's what's required?
I feel like the community perception is very different. I've heard people complaining about how the rates have gone up this year and how it would have been much better being used on sustainable practices and other resources. But then I've also heard people saying that it's a good thing because it's going to go towards sealing all the dirt roads just everywhere. And I feel like it is something that is important to young people, as it is something that has started having a lot more awareness come to it in the last few years. So a lot of young people have been getting on board with it and trying to make as much of an impact as they can. There were thousands of young people who went to the climate strikes to show their support for helping with climate action and helping to live sustainably. So I feel like it is something that the future generations will care about and try to do what they can to help improve.
Yeah, likewise. I think nowadays, with a lot of the progress around climate action, a lot of the youth are very engaged and willing to take action. But also I think the disconnect or the difference between mentalities surrounding climate change really surrounds their education level. A lot of students, I feel like it's human behaviour. If you don't understand something, you reject it or you just rather not know. And I believe that with education around climate change, it enables students and encourages them to take action. I know this year there's a part of the curriculum surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations, and a lot of students didn't really understand what big issue was around climate change. You hear it on the news, and there's people fighting, Donald Trump rejects it, you know what I mean? But then we were learning about it, and students like, oh, okay, this makes sense, it's affecting us, and it's ongoing. So I believe that with education comes power, and then that in turn promotes action. How does the local government believe the community expects them in terms of sustainability? What do you believe the community expects of you as councillors?
I think in the first instance, our community certainly expects us to look after the local environment. So the things people see every day are the things they are most concerned about often. And then it goes to that question of the diversity of the community and the community not being one thing that thinks in the same way, but a whole lot of people with a whole lot of different opinions. I feel really lucky to be a councillor in Darebin where there is a heightened awareness of this issue and where people really want council to be involved and celebrate council's involvement. So lots of people in our community are really proud to live in the community which was the first in the world to declare a climate emergency. Lots of staff are coming to work at Darebin because of the leadership that we've shown. And that kind of enthusiasm for doing something, for showing leadership and taking action is a bit contagious. So you then get a movement of people within the community who want to see action, and that's important. And that's one thing we as a council are trying to build. So we've had climate ambassadors, sort of champions dinners to actually build climate emergency ambassadors in our local community, to have community leaders who will then go and spread the message and have conversations that can lead to change, bring more people on board. So we're actively looking to promote that and to grow a movement of people who understand how important change is. We get very little feedback that that's not what people want us to do, but I'm under no illusion that there aren't some people in the community who think that council is investing too much in that space.
Oh, I think it's very interesting what you said. There's a lot of enthusiasm surrounding your community. Where do you think that comes from in terms of your community?
Darebin is generally quite a progressive community that has a very low Conservative vote. So I think across the whole of Australia, we are the electorate with the lowest vote for Conservative parties of any electorate in Australia. And that means that we don't have a lot of people opposing action, which tends to mean there's an enabling environment across the whole community on a whole lot of social progressive issues. So, we're a council that's had a lot of firsts. We were the first council in Australia to introduce a trans and gender diverse swim night at our local pool because we saw that as an important part of inclusion, but also that's an important part of demonstrating leadership. And one of the things we now see is that councils all over Victoria have introduced trans and gender diverse swim nights. We were one of the first councils to say that we wouldn't celebrate on the 26th of January, and that for us was a very important stand that we took in support of local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who told us that that was something that mattered deeply to them. And so I think, it's really lovely to be part of a council that's willing to make bold, progressive statements on social equity issues and on the environment. And we do that partly because our community cares about what happens locally, but partly because we see that we're lucky to be in a political environment where we're able to show that leadership with a view to influencing others. So we're quite deliberate in lots of our actions. On the climate emergency, we've been reaching out to other councils and trying to spread the word and influence others. So, and that's something we can do because our community is actually saying they like seeing that and they want more of that type of action.
And you, Tony, I'm interested to see what you have to say.
So Yarra Ranges is incredibly diverse. It's almost a microcosm of Australia. While we don't have big office towers and that sort of thing, we've certainly got areas that are quite urbanised, and we've got areas that are very rural, that are remote, accessible through unsealed roads, and some places I may not see people too often come down the road every day. So we've just got this widespread set of people that the common core they would expect is that council makes good use of their money. So I think that's where sustainability comes back to saying, if you're doing things sustainably, you're doing them in a way that's both sensible in use of resources, but it's also reflective of protecting the incredible environment that we're fortunate to live in that part of the world, and ensuring that's looked after. Really beyond that, there's going to be shades of interest from people who are very switched on in terms of aspiring for council to take a very strong leadership position and drive change in the community, through to others who are probably saying, who would reflect that view that that's not the role of council. And so we've really got to walk the line that encourages as much as we can, as many people in the community to come with us on that journey. It's an interesting situation with local government because effectively we're monopoly service providers. So in a way, if you're not happy with your local government, you don't get to shop around. That is your local government. So as young people, you get to choose where you buy things from, as everyone does. You can choose values-based organisations. You can say, I'm only going to buy things from organisations that are very strongly values-based. And that's your right, and I'd encourage you to do that because that's also how we drive change in this world. But when it comes to local government, that may not be the case because you only have that local government to choose from. And so I suppose through the influence in terms of the ballot box and through engagement with the council, you can start to drive that change in behaviour. And it's far easier if a council is reflective of the community and where the community needs to go than to be fighting the community. So I think it's trying to do that the best it can to reflect where the community needs to go, be in step with the community, and ideally a couple of steps ahead and providing that leadership.
So what does the local government expect the community to do in terms of sustainability, and how do they expect them to be able to achieve this?
There's many ways in which local government engages with our community. Yes, while we want to avoid the roads, rates and rubbish would be one of those things that clearly is a council responsibility. So when it comes to sustainable practices, it's really quite important that the services that council already provides, that people actually understand how they're offered and that they basically support those. So we do have recycling. The good news is we've never had a problem with recycling going to landfill. We've had a good, strong connection with a company that does make good use of the recycled material, so that is ensured and sustained. But if, for example, people don't know the right way to handle the waste, if they're not putting the right things in recycling, it will actually contaminate the waste stream and stop that potential load of recycling being able to be recycled. That could be as simple as putting a pizza box out which has got grease over it in with a whole mix of newspapers, and that might mean that whole batch can't be recycled. So that's a challenge. So I think at a minimum is having the community to understand why there's rules in there around how waste is handled and follow those rules. That's probably at a minimum. Beyond that, it's to say if council's putting out programs or encouraging things, really it's trying to have people come on board to understand why those things would be advocated for and to have as strong a participation as possible.
Just going back to your point about the recycling, I've heard a lot of people in the Upwey community in particular talking about how the recycling's just going to landfill so they don't bother with it anymore. So is that...
It's incredibly tragic. I think it was an old line which said something like, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth's had a chance to put its boots on. So negative ideas and misunderstandings propagate so easily, and the facts are just so much harder to get out there. So we've put out every possible assurance we can to say that recycling is continuing, you should absolutely continue to recycle. People are saying, well, you should come put a sticker on a bin, or we should deliver a message to our doors. Well, there's 58,000 properties. It costs us money and it costs ratepayers money to deliver those messages, which is not necessarily the best use. So all we can do is continue to put that message through. But we have a problem in Victoria and Australia generally with the way waste is handled. And we don't have consistently good ways of handling waste. We need greater clarity, local government, state government, federal government, on smarter ways of handling our waste and doing it in a cohesive manner so that everyone understands what waste is handled in what way and that people can adhere to those as best they can. But there's confusion there between municipalities. You might go and visit your friend's place and think you're going to put things in the yellow bin, and they don't have a yellow bin. They might have a different coloured bin. So that's confusing, or people go to a holiday home. So we need to do some things collectively in local government that make it easier for people to do the right thing. And we need to consistently provide assurance that if you do put waste into recycling, that it will be recycled.
I think in respect to what we expect from the community, we hope that the community will read information that we give and engage with us. So we have to be very careful not to tell people what to do, how to think, because that never goes down well. But what we would love from our community is greater engagement on a whole lot of issues and for them to enter into the conversation with us about what they want. Tony's picked up a really important thing, which is the recycling and the need to avoid contamination, because if the contamination gets above a certain level in recycling bins, then it does go to landfill. And the lower the contamination rates are, the greater the value of the recycled content and the more likely it is to actually find a new home as a useful product in the future. But I think that this goes back to that question of the extent to which responding to the climate emergency is about individual responsibility and the extent to which it's about actually creating better laws and regulations and environments in which people live. And I'm really mindful that we could go out to our community and say, make sure you change all your light bulbs and switch off, your energy when you're not using it and recycle correctly. And if you do all those things, that will solve the climate emergency. And I would be lying if I said that to people. And so I think we need to balance our messages to the community and our expectations of the community with our expectations of the state and federal government, because we will lose people if we tell them that by recycling correctly and putting on solar panels that they can solve this problem. what we actually need from our community is to mobilise and call for change. We need 100% of the school kids in our community going on the school strike for climate, and we need every adult in the community going there and supporting them, because the failure of state and federal governments is such that I'm inclined to think that it's only by mass civil disobedience and participation in actions to actually show that we will not stand by and do nothing that we're actually going to get the change required.
And from Yarra Ranges' perspective, as far as local government expecting the community to act, as a volunteer, I was involved in plastic bag-free initiatives which were supported by the local government, but it wasn't until the state government put a ban on single-use plastic bags that the local businesses took action. So sometimes the local community might be mobilised, but requires a legislative state government stance to mandate change in businesses to mobilise community. So it can be really difficult for community to meet the expectations of local government when sometimes behavioural change can be brought about not just via education but by legislative governance.
I think it's really interesting hearing from councillors, personally, because I haven't had any experience speaking to any people in a certain power. But I wanted to ask, how do you think you could engage with the youth in terms of sustainability? Because I know a lot of youth don't have access necessarily to councillors. I know there's open door policy, but I feel like a lot of us don't feel comfortable or have any experience with that type of thing. So what do you think?
Council already has a number of programs that engage young people in our community. One of them in Darebin is a youth citizens jury, where we have a group of young people who regularly come together to generate ideas that they'd like to feed into council processes. That's been pretty amazing. I think sometimes councillors, we underestimate the ability of young people to participate in quite amazing ways. I was reminded recently just how extraordinary young people can be. We had a Victorian Electoral Commission representation review, and this is quite a technical review where the VEC looks at the number of electors per ward and whether that's right and the boundaries are in the right place. We had a young person who was 14 who participated in that review, made a submission. He had got his head completely around the topic, and he actually came to make a submission to the VEC on that issue, and he was just before me, and I was blown away because his technical knowledge was far superior to mine. And we've had other young people who have actually come and spoken to council and come and spoken to our climate ambassadors dinner on climate change. They have been youth leaders in the climate strike action and movement, and I think that we need to constantly look for more ways to elevate the voices of those young people and also encourage younger people to run for council. We're a council which is quite progressive, which would be incredibly open to that, but the youngest councillors on our council are now in their mid-30s, and that's a lot younger than some councils where people are probably almost at retirement age. But where are the people who were 20 or 22 or 18 getting elected onto council, having their voice heard in those formal decision-making processes? And I think that would be fantastic as well.
I think it's really important just to understand, as we've discovered today, there's not a great deal of awareness of what councils are already doing, and I think every council is doing a lot on the level of sustainability and what they should be doing to improving the local environment and reduce their environmental footprint. But it takes two parties to come together on that, so I'm hearing from you that council needs to redouble our efforts and do a better job of communicating. But we also need to find all the ways in which we can engage people and encourage young people to speak to councillors by all means, but every council would have people who work in sustainability and talk to them, find out what council's already doing to have an understanding of that. If you've got questions around waste, ring up. If you're not happy with the answer you're getting, ask again or write a letter to say, I'm not really happy with what's happening. We've got a problem. You don't seem to be addressing this. How can I get some action on this? Because we've got really good people in local government at all levels who do their very best to respond to the community. And if you go about it in a way that's persuasive and you're trying for an outcome that aligns to policies that council might have already put out or really important things that we must do as a society, and encouraging that good behaviour, then that's incredibly valued. One of the challenges we have is that there's, and hopefully it's not among young people, but there's this long-standing perception of what local government does and people in local government, and that It's not a positive perception. We've got fantastic people who work in local government. They do amazing things for the community. They're incredibly stretched to do so many things in so many services, and they're absolutely doing things in sustainability. So if you've got questions about sustainability, find out who at council is that sustainability officer or officers, and find out how you can engage with them, because there may be things you can do that helps support them to help support the overall community by working cooperatively.
So, going back to the working cooperatively thing, what sort of actions do you think that both the council and the community could take to work cooperatively and to not have any disconnection between the two in what's going on?
I probably tend to look at these things objectively. It's best to look at things like data which inform us as to what is the greenhouse gas footprint of our local communities and our council operations, and to go through a process of identifying how can we reduce those things, how can we find alternatives, because you're dealing then in facts and you can set aside people's emotional responses as much as you can. So I think council needs to very much, or every council needs to get their own house in order first. That's their initial prime responsibility. And it needs to explain to the community what it's doing and why it's doing those things. And then I think it's from there, it's a matter of identifying what are the most significant areas that will make the biggest difference. So, for example, in Yarra Ranges, it would be things like the 40% of waste that is food waste that's going into bins and ends up in landfill, because the way we're currently dealing with that waste is only in that manner. So we need to work with the community to say, how can you reduce your food waste? Maybe growing your own produce, find ways of dealing with leftovers, avoid having that food waste going into the general waste. So whether that's through composting or through other means of dealing with it yourself. And that's going to make a big difference in terms of what's going into landfill. It's going to reduce methane. So there's a range of things just in that area. But when we're still at the stage where people don't even know what to put in what bin and what plastics can be recycled and what can't, we've got a long way to go. So I think that's a key area that council has to work on in terms of education, engagement. And I think we can probably do a lot by working in the schools, because young people are very open to ideas. They can be influential on their parents. Most young people want to do the right thing by the planet. It's just when they get a bit older, they can get a bit lazy and distracted by other things.
I support what Tony said. I think actually, particularly working in schools, on a number of occasions I've been asked to come and talk to kids in schools about local government and what we do, various aspects. And I always love those conversations, because I think we have this opportunity from the time kids who are in grade 5 or grade 6 to have a better understanding of what their council does and how they can participate. And that's a fantastic thing, so that from the time they first become voters, that they are engaged in the process and actually understand that they can truly influence what's happening locally through the decisions. People often think that the state and the federal elections are the ones that matter. I think actually what happens on your council has much more of an impact on your day-to-day lives in your local community and the type of services that are available to you and the way they're delivered.
I've got one final question for the panel. I'd love to hear in short from you all, what does the future of local government look like to make real change in climate? Susan?
I think that it would be fantastic in the future if local government was at the forefront of being able to say, we live in a zero emissions community and we have achieved this with our residents, with our council operations, and to be at the forefront of a movement of people who actually embrace that as something that everyone would want to do. I think we're not quite there yet, but we're moving in that direction.
I think as a facilitator and enabler of change, so one of the biggest barriers, and we've come across it today, is it is quite complex. There's a lot of moving parts in our society, and lots of things that through our daily actions and how we exist as humans manifest themselves in terms of impact on the environment. It is quite complex. We have very smart, sustainability officers. We've got some very switched on councillors who understand this, and we've got a community that probably don't need to know all of that in quite that degree of complexity. In some way, they need to know what they can do and have that shared in a way that they know what action they can take and be encouraged to do it. So, because we've touched on before, so that whole spectrum, there can be people who just want to ignore it all, dispute it, and people who are very concerned but don't quite know what to do at the other extreme. So we can actually share with people some practical actions they can take, some practical actions local government's taking, some practical actions that we expect our state and federal government should be taking, and we can do that in a cohesive manner across local government, then I think we're really going to start making a real difference in the world.
And our youth leaders, what would you like to see the future of local government in this space doing?
I'd like to, in the future, I'd hope that it would be one where the amount of emissions that were being produced were greatly reduced so that everyone could live more sustainably, and where everyone has the knowledge of how to recycle things and is living as sustainably as they can with what's given to them. So, yeah, basically one where the community and the council are working together to help climate action.
Yeah, I also agree. But I think it stems from, like Susan touched on before, the council members, there's a lack of diversity in terms of age. I think a future in which the local government is more diverse and reflects or is representative of the community that they serve will help in the progression of climate action. And I believe that will be a great benefit towards society as a whole.
And that's all for this episode of Emerging Sustainably. The 2019 Emerging Leaders Program participants would like to thank LG Pro for their support and for making their offices available for the recording of this podcast. A big thank you to the Victorian Student Representative Council, Sustainability Victoria, and all our guests for donating their time and insights. If you'd like to learn more about what your council is doing to plan for a more sustainable future, we encourage you to reach out to your local government sustainability officer.